Hi, my name is Debbie Rami. I work at MedStar Medical Referral, which is a part of Sepharadim, and I want to welcome everybody, and we're very excited to have this lecture. And Dr. Stuart Dietrich, I'm just going to say a little bit about him. He's the medical director of JScreen, and he's a community pediatrician on the faculty of NYU. And he's the former medical director of the Jewish Genetic Disease Consortium. Just to say that also I'm working at MedStar for 14 years, and he's been helping me. He's always available whenever anybody calls us and needs any pediatric advice or anything. I just email him, he emails me back. His expertise is amazing, and it helps us to do a great job. So we want to thank him for that. And he also is a recognized expert and lecturer in the area of Jewish genetic disorders. And it's a very important topic, and we're very happy everybody came, and we hope that it's going to be very informative. And without further ado, Dr. Stuart Dietrich.
Thank you, Debbie. Let me just grab something. There's a letter that somebody wanted me to read tonight. So there's two of us speaking tonight about this very important program for the community. Esty Rose, who's here from Emory University, JScreen, was kind enough to come tonight. Esty's been critical in helping us set the program up over the last year and a half, working with the rabbis in the community and working with the medical side of the testing program, which we're going to talk about tonight. Just a little bit of background. Most of you know me as a pediatrician. That's all I am. I'm a meat and potatoes pediatrician from Brooklyn. I've been privileged over the years to have developed interests and proficiency in dealing with individuals with high-risk disorders. And believe it or not, when I was in residency, the worst area of study for me and the worst rotation was genetics. I found it to be boring and unusual, and I couldn't deal with it. And later in life, it actually became my strongest proficiency, and I don't know how that happened. But a couple of years back, I became the Associate Medical Director of the Division of Familial Dysautonomia at NYU, which is the only purely Jewish disease in the world. The World Center is at NYU, and I spent years training there under Dr. Felicia Axelrod, who's now retired. And we were privileged to be one of the first diseases where the actual gene was discovered. And today we have patients who are being treated with a therapy that impacts the defective gene. It's called the ICAP gene. Esty's probably familiar with the therapy. Later on, I was actually chosen, and it was a real privilege. There was an organization called the Jewish Genetic Disease Consortium, which were groups of disease groups, National Gaucher, National Tay-Sachs, National Dysautonomia, and they all came together as an advocacy group because they wanted to develop an educational and a testing program, and they chose me as their medical director a couple of years back. I spent a few years with them. I ran their educational program, and we actually set up the first national salivary DNA screening program and mass screening program in the country out of NYU. And so I'm very proud of the genetic side of my career, although it's not the one that most people know me for. Most of them know me for sore throats and screaming at everybody to make sure they get immunized. So I have to say that my office is far more exciting than genetics, but tonight we're talking about genetics. So JPatable is the new organization that was founded recently, the new company, and we partnered with a very reputable group called JScreen. JScreen is a not-for-profit organization that was established that works out of Atlanta, Emory University. And in 2018, so it was really started in 2017, we decided to create the first ever fully informed genetics screening and matching program in the Jewish community. Now, screening and matching, we're going to talk about what that means in a few minutes, but most of you are familiar with other screening programs. There's a screening program in the Ashkenaz community called Dar Yesharim, which is a wonderful program that was set up years ago, but it was set up with a different emphasis. When Tay-Sachs disease first came about, that was the first disease, and their program, you don't get results, you simply get matching, and they test for fewer diseases. We'll talk about that in a moment, but they simply do the matching. You call them up and you match A to B, and you say whether they should go on and get married if they're genetically compatible. Our program is actually set up as an informed program. Every participant gets genetic counseling with their results, and every participant who chooses to go on and get married can contact JPatable, and we will compare the results and make sure that they're genetically compatible. The mission is to reduce the incidence by education, awareness, and facilitation of screening and couple compatibility matching. And this is a fully medically supervised program. It utilizes the most cutting-edge technology. DNA sequencing is the technology that's used in the laboratory to identify every single mutation possible. And the goal of this program is to prevent disorders from occurring before they happen, not to treat them after they happen, but to prevent these things before they happen. So we're going to talk tonight about a couple of broad topics, and then I'm going to narrow it down. What does it mean to be a carrier? Why are Jews, Ashkenaz, and Sephardim at risk for being carriers for genetic disorders? How does the program work, the new program, JPatable, JScreen? What diseases need to be screened for? And what options does a person have if they're already married? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit of detail because it applies to the community as well. So, what does it mean to be a silent carrier or a carrier? A carrier, every disease, every recessive disease, and we're talking about recessive, you'll hear that term over and over again. A recessive disease means there's a contributing gene from each parent. Each parent brings a gene into that child, and if the child picks up both genes from those parents, that child is an affected child, has the disease that we're trying to prevent. So an affected individual is somebody who doesn't carry one copy of a gene, but they carry both copies of a gene. And if you have both copies of a gene, it means you have the disease that's associated with that gene, with that mutation. So years ago, when we used to start doing screening, often I heard from people was, no, we don't need to be screened. We don't have any of these diseases or carriers in our family. And we would look back and we would build their genetic trees over time. And here's an example, and I'm just going to go down the line very quickly, of a father who's carrying one of those genes. And you can see half of his children managed to pick up the one copy of the gene. They're not affected. They're healthy. Carriers are perfectly healthy. There's nothing wrong with being a carrier. And then those silent carriers go on and build their own families. And you can see the carriers continue to form in the family and they continue to grow. And then at some point, one carrier meets another carrier. And when two carriers get together, the result is 25% of those pregnancies result in an affected baby. That child now has the disease that each of those parents were a carrier for. Every time they get pregnant, there's a 25% chance. If those of you who recall your biology, 25% of the pregnancies will result in an affected child, 50% chance that they will deliver a baby who has a carrier for the same disease, not an affected, and then they can have a healthy child as well who is not a carrier. So you can have healthy non-carriers, healthy carriers, or a 25% chance, unfortunately, of having an affected baby. So why did these genes come about? You know, I'm religious. I don't think God does anything without intent. And we spent many years studying the theories behind why Jews in particular developed these genetic disorders. Why did we become carriers for genetic disorders? And there's many theories that are out there, but there's a couple just two that I'm going to present tonight, which I always found to be interesting. Let's talk for a minute about where did Jews originate? Jews originated, we all know, and they originated in what we now call Eretz Yisrael, Israel. We know that geographically, Sephardim, Ashkenazim, we all originated from that part of the world. After the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, Jews dispersed. The Sephardic Jews dispersed to certain regions. The Ashkenaz Jews dispersed to other regions. Let's look at the Ashkenaz Jews in Europe in the 9th century, 10th century, 15th century. There was a lot of persecution going on during those years, obviously. There were pogroms, there were persecution of Jews. Jews were being lost not only to political and violent causes, but they were being lost to medical causes as well, infections, the bubonic plague, the black plague, tuberculosis. These were all diseases that were prevalent in the time. And when individual develops a sporadic mutation of a gene, when the gene goes bad, when there's some malfunction of that gene, and all of a sudden your community whittles down or your community moves away, you then have to find people within your own community not only to live with, but to procreate with and to get married and to have children as well. And that's how a lot of these founder mutations began. My grandfather was from a small town in Poland where 70% of the people in the town had the same last name, Ditchett. 70% of the people in one town. There were probably 600 people in the town, and most of them had the last name Ditchett. That wasn't by coincidence. There were a lot of Ditchetts that were probably marrying each other over generations throughout the European period. So when we look, as we said, at a founder gene, it starts out as one individual mutation, and as people die off, they're persecuted, or they move away, that founder then finds other people to live with. And eventually, as they meet other people with other mutations, these mutations get multiplied. That's why the Ashkenazim had such a high rate of carrier rates. But the more fascinating reason, and this is something that I prescribe to, a lot of genes, although genetic mutations do bad things and cause disease, some of these mutations, especially in carriers, did good things. For instance, it's known that individuals who are carriers for Tay-Sachs disease have some significant protection against tuberculosis. And tuberculosis was one of the main killers of Jews and non-Jews in 14th, 15th century Europe. So if you were a carrier for Tay-Sachs, you actually survived if you were exposed to tuberculosis. That's not a founder effect gene, but that's one of the benefits of certain genetic mutations. Now, Ashkenaz Jews, as you know, ended up in Europe, in the northern parts of Europe, Poland, Germany, the Rhineland. Sephardic Jews migrated after this 70 CE down into northern Africa, Spain, countries like that where Sephardim originated. Interestingly enough, we were talking about this a few minutes ago with Nancy, the breast cancer gene, which is not a gene that we're screening for in this program, but the BRCA gene, which you've probably all heard of, is one of the two genes that I know of that is identical between Ashkenaz and Sephardim, down to the smallest element of the base pair, the nucleic acid base pairs. The reason for that is because the BRCA gene has been tracked back to the time of the Beit HaMikdash. And the way we know that Ashkenaz and Sephardim were both there at the Beit HaMikdash was the BRCA gene and the Cohen gene. The Cohen gene is a different circumstance, but the BRCA gene certainly is evidence that we all came from the same geographic location and that we all originated from the same genetic materials. So as they migrate, as you can see, this is the area of the Middle East. The Ashkenaz Jews migrated to Europe. This is more of an Ashkenaz migration pattern. Many of them were persecuted in Europe, and eventually most of them ended up on the shores of the United States or South America. So this slide just shows you a little bit about who we are in terms of our genetic potential. The Ashkenazim, again, primarily the European countries, the Sephardim, primarily North Africa and many of the Arab states, and obviously many Sephardim had genetic influence from France and Spain. Remember, after the Spanish Inquisition, many Sephardim and Ashkenaz were expelled from Spain, and they ended up in the United States and South America as well. So we all know that we're at risk. Ashkenaz are at more risk than Sephardim for most genetic disorders. That's the way it was for generations, for the last many generations. When we started this program, and I want to speak a little bit about how we started it. As you know, I work with MedStar. I work with many of the rabbis in the community on the Ashkenaz and the Sephardic side. I started talking to Rabbi Ozeri a couple of years ago because we started noticing that we were seeing more genetic disorders in the Sephardic community, more children being born with some terrible genetic disorders. Now, Ashkenaz worldwide, or let's look at North America, the Ashkenaz community, unfortunately, has a very high rate of intermarriage. Nationally, the rate of intermarriage among Ashkenazic Jews is about 70%. 70%. 7 out of 10 Ashkenazic Jews marry outside of the Jewish faith. What's interesting from a genetic standpoint is there is a good chance that many of these genetic disorders, or many of these genetic mutations are going to be diluted, so to say, because they're marrying with individuals from other faiths, other backgrounds, who came from other parts of the geographic world. Sephardim have a different issue, which is, in my view, one of the great benefits of the Sephardic community. Sephardic community, even non-Orthodox Sephardim, generally marry within their faith. I'm not saying it's universal, there's always cases where it's not true, but for the most part, they marry within their faith. And if you remember the slide on founder effect of genes, when you marry within your community, you will find other carriers who carry common mutations. That is what we are seeing now in many of the community members. You may not know about them. They may not be waving a flag that they have a child or a family member with a genetic disorder, but they're out there. And I know that they're out there because I'm one of the physicians who treats those families. I'm going to read in a few minutes a statement that one of the family members wrote this afternoon. I asked her to write something to tell us about what her experience has been and what she thinks of the program. But to the credit of the Sephardic rabbis, we started meeting a year and a half ago during the summer, almost 2 years ago. They wanted a community education program first. They wanted us to start reaching out to the community to educate them on why they need to be screened and what they need to be screened for. And then they wanted, as I did, to implement a real program which could prevent some of these disorders. Rabbi Ozeri has put together a beautiful committee, a rabbinical council to guide us. I met with 9 of the rabbis about 2 months ago to go over the process that we're working through right now. And everything we do along the way, we're doing with the guidance of the Sephardic Rabbinical Council. It's critical that we do that because I want the community to feel comfortable with what the rabbis think are appropriate. I want them to feel comfortable with what we on the medical side feel is appropriate, and they've been very helpful. So our proposal for the new JPatable and JScreen program is to start testing folks around the age of 18, before they get married, before they start dating. Most people, I mean, some people are still getting married young, but not many under the age of 18. So let's assume everybody's getting married beyond that point, or most people. So what we're doing is starting with an educational outreach to the high schools, to the 12th graders. Batsheva Adams, who works with our organization now, is going to be doing the high school outreach program to work with the local high schools and the high schools in other states as well, where Sephardic Jews are, to educate the 12th graders on the new screening program and how they should register for the program. The registration takes place on a website called JPatable. Now, everybody, the website is up for educational purposes, but it will not be active for registration until around March 15th. We're working out some of the processes with JScreen and with Emory University until it's active. But up until then, you can read all about the program on the website, jpatable.com. The registration is very simple. On our side, it's a very simple registration and consent form, and then you pay a fee and you get transferred over to the JScreen area of the website, who are the folks who not only do the genetic testing, but who do the genetic counseling as well. This program is being established as a salivary DNA program. The testing is not done by blood unless the specimen from saliva is not adequate or if there's a problem with it. The person who registers gets a test kit in the mail. They get a phone call or an email from one of our dedicated genetic counselors at JScreen who's going to clarify their genetic background, their ancestry, what countries their families might have been from. And then they get a kit in the mail and they spit into a bottle. They send the kit back, and 3 to 4 weeks later, we get results. At the end of that 3 to 4 week period, the participant gets either a phone call or an email saying they want to set up a conference call with the individual who is tested. One of the genetic counselors from JScreen does a full genetic counseling session on the phone. They explain to them if they're a carrier for nothing. Hopefully everybody will be a carrier for nothing, but we know that's not the case. Or they'll explain to them, listen, you're a carrier for familial dysautonomia. 1 in 30 people carry that gene. It's not a big deal unless you marry somebody who's a carrier for the same gene. They'll go through a very thorough process, which Esty is going to explain a little bit about how we counsel a young person that they are a carrier. There is no shame in being a carrier for a genetic disorder. The only thing being a carrier for a genetic disorder supports is the fact that you're Jewish. We, as Jews, carry many more genetic disorders. We're not sick because of it, we just are carriers. My own children are carriers for genetic disorders. My kids all got married when the panels were smaller. When the panel expanded to the larger number of diseases, I retested my married children. One of them is sitting right here, Sammy Ditchik. He's actually one of the administrators for the program. And he was positive, can I say it? Sure. For 3 genetic disorders that we did not know about, that we had within our family. We immediately had his wife retested. His wife was not a common carrier for any of those 3 disorders, and life went on, and his second baby, God willing, is being born in about a month and a half. So that's how it works. You're a carrier, no big deal. I'm a carrier. I'm a card-carrying carrier for at least 3 to 4 genetic disorders, my wife and myself. No big deal. I have healthy grandchildren. I babysit for them all the time. They're healthy. The key is that both parties get tested so you don't marry a common carrier. Now, the participant receives copies of their results, written hard copies of their results, a medical record, so to say. You should share those results with anybody you choose or nobody. You can give those results to your obstetrician gynecologist, to your primary care provider, to your parents, to your grandmother. Share it with whoever you want or share it with nobody. I advise people to make that decision on their own. Esty can speak to it. The only person who I insist that they do share it with is when they do family planning, their obstetrician. Because what happens when a woman goes to the obstetrician today in 2018, when you go, if you're here in the New York area especially, where there's a lot of Jews, and I used to lecture the obstetricians on this subject, most obstetricians, once they identify you as Jewish, will tell you to get a genetic test. They will ask you to put out your arm, and they'll do genetic testing on you. But you're pregnant already, because most people only go to an obstetrician when they're pregnant already. So then if you're identified as a carrier when you're pregnant, you need to urgently test your husband or your spouse at that point. And then you have a very big, tense dilemma going on. What if your husband's a carrier for the same disease? Your baby could be affected. It's a very uncomfortable scenario. The best scenario is you have your results and you give them to your OB up front so they know what you've been tested for. Sometimes an obstetrician will say, oh, who were you tested through? This and this organization. The obstetrician will check the box and say, okay, they have genetic testing. But the obstetrician does not know what diseases were tested for or how many. Here, you get a written copy, the result goes with you, and you give it to whoever you please. It's critical to share it with your obstetrician. Now, if you're a carrier, it's also critical to let the rest of your family know that they need to be tested as well. Because if you have one carrier in the family, there's a good chance you have several carriers in the family. When you're ready to date, if you're single, ready to date, you have your results, you're 19, 20 years old, you call JPatable, that's our office number. You'll have a unique user code. We'll ask you for certain identification. Both parties have to consent. Dr. Ditchik, can Dr. Ditchik's son marry Mrs. Smith's daughter? We'll compare the results and we'll advise you on whether you are both carrying any common carrier states. We're not going to tell you what the other person has, and we're not even going to discuss what you have in particular. We're strictly going to be discussing genetic couple compatibility. Do you have a carrier gene in common with your potential spouse? We advise to do it before you start dating. If you have somebody in mind, a shidduch, an arranged marriage, you can say, by the way, can we just check JPatable first to make sure we're okay genetically? There are people who fall in love, right? That's the geneticist challenge and the genetics challenge. If they fall in love, we've had this discussion. I think the rabbis and the family need to be involved in that discussion because there are implications of getting married if you were both carrying a common gene. One of the implications are that most pregnancies that you will go through, you will have to go through in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to have a healthy baby. There are costs involved in that. There are issues of spontaneity involved in that when you're talking about a young couple. So it's a more complicated issue if you choose to get married even though you're a carrier. I certainly would discourage it. I know the rabbis would discourage it, but that's a decision that each couple has to make on their own. What type of carrier diseases is the new program testing for? So this program is only testing for recessive disorders. Does everybody remember what recessive disorders means? Recessive disorders means that both parents are contributing carriers to the genetic disorder. Excuse me one second. I'm having a Marco Rubio moment. Pretty bad. Anyways, so JPATable program is only testing for recessive disorders. Now, what does that mean in English? JScreen, which has been around a number of years now, which is an incredible organization, JScreen includes in their usual panel disorders that are called single gene disease disorders or X-linked disorders, where only one, let's say a mother, might be carrying the gene and transmitting it to a son. We are not testing for those disorders. We have a panel that is strictly recessive. This has been in discussion with the rabbis, and the reason for it, I want to spell out so you understand it. If we test for X-linked disorders, meaning disorders carried by one parent, where the other parent has no contribution, there is a potential of stigmatizing the individual who we're testing. The rabbis in the community, the Rabbinical Advisory Board, was opposed to that, and I agree with them. So our program is strictly for recessive, contributing gene from each parent. So we're only testing for recessive disorders. The panel we're using is currently a panel of 213 disorders. It could go up a little, it could go down a little over time. We have certain diseases that are only being identified now that may have to be added to the panel. There may be diseases that will be excluded from the panel over time if there's a reason to exclude them. But currently, our panel tests for 213 diseases. It's a very comprehensive panel. JScreen's developed this panel over a period of time. It's in agreement with the panel. They're using it at Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai tests for even more. They test for about 281 diseases. Some institutions test for less. You'll find that as time goes on, people are going to be testing for more carrier states because we want to prevent these horrible diseases. Some of the carrier states are very rare, but being rare doesn't mean that you don't test for it. It means that you have to look even harder for it. The panel is comprehensive and includes all of the common Ashkenazi and Sephardic disorders. We don't separate how you order your test. If you're Jewish, you get the same panel. You get an Ashkenaz panel, you get a Sephardic panel. We're all one for that purpose. And the reason for it, there are very few families also that don't have mixed ancestry. Look around the room, think about it from your own perspective. A lot of Sephardim have married Ashkenaz over the years. Sometimes you don't know about it. I had a case a few years ago of Gaucher disease where it was diagnosed and they had no idea that there was an Ashkenaz influence. When we did their genetic tree, we found out that they had a great-great-grandfather who was Ashkenaz, and there was significant Ashkenaz influence as a result. So how do we minimize this? I'm not going to spend too much time here. There's an issue called residual risk whenever you do medical testing or genetic testing. Residual risk means that every medical test that we do has a certain amount of error built into it. When we started looking at genes and mutations a number of years ago, the residual risk was huge. It could take months and months to look for any single mutation, and it could be missed because we didn't have the technology that we have today. Today, most of the genetic tests, and Esty, correct me if I'm mistaken, are 99% accurate with the DNA sequencing analysis. There's always a chance for an error. So no medical test is perfect. You go for an angiogram, it's not perfect. They may miss a lesion on your angiogram that they couldn't see because of your position. However, the way you reduce residual risk is two ways. One way is to volunteer as much information to the genetic counselor as humanly possible when they question you. In other words, do you have a family member who has any specific genetic disorder, something rare that we should know about? It helps them narrow down the testing and make sure they don't miss certain things. The other way to minimize residual risk is to have both parties tested. Let's say Sammy Ditchett gets tested, and his test, there was a 1% chance of an error, and we made an error, or the lab made an error on that 1% chance. But his wife was tested as well. What is the chances that the error would be made on both ends of the equation? Very, very small. So when you test both partners, you minimize the residual risk involved in the testing, and it's a very important thing to realize. It doesn't pay to get tested if you're not going to compare it to the results of your partner or your spouse. The Sephardic Community Program and Matching Program, as I said, it's fully coordinated with cooperation of the Rabbinical Advisory Council, headed up by Rabbi David Ozeri. Rabbi Ozeri, by the way, is Masali Kedushin at a wedding tonight in his shul at Yad Yosef. He apologized he couldn't be here. He was in Mexico yesterday. He's the only person who has a worse life than me, without a doubt, without a doubt. And he's much nicer than me, which is fascinating. We use salivary or saliva DNA technology. We don't use blood drawing unless there's a problem with the test or there's a sample error. Then you might be called back and say you have to run in and get a blood test. It's not common. Usually the salivary DNA works out beautifully. The educational programs are starting with community lectures and 12th grade outreach. As I said, all results are reported by genetic counselors from JScreen. The participants receive written copies of results, and the matching by JPatable with both parties consenting. Both parties have to consent to the request for compatibility matching. I am the one doing the compatibility matching. We're training a number of other people to be involved, but we have 3 or 4 levels of safeguards built into it. One of the great levels is I get to call these great genetic counselors at Emory every time I have a question, and they straighten me out, which is incredible because they have some of the best genetic counselors I've ever come across. So what options do I have if I'm married already? This question comes up a lot. What if you're married and you haven't been tested? Now, if you're married and you're living here in New York especially, there is a very good chance if you're getting pregnant that you, A, will have already been tested by your obstetrician for at least a certain number of diseases, or B, they're going to test you when you show up. Because people often don't have their results in hand, the doctor just chooses to retest them at the time. But if you are married and you're discovered to be a carrier, and your spouse is discovered to be a carrier, a common carrier for the same genetic mutation, you do have options. You have to go through genetic counseling to understand your options, but the options come down to getting pregnant in a safe way, which means in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. What is pre-implantation genetic diagnosis? It's where they have a fertilized egg, basically a sperm and an egg together, and they can do testing on the genetic material of that fertilized egg, and the IVF specialist or the PGD specialist can select out a healthy embryo to implant in the mom. It's costly. It is not fun for a couple to go through, but if you're identified as a common carrier, you only have 3 options. Option number 1 is go through IVF and pre-implantation diagnosis to have a healthy baby. Option number 2 is to roll the dice and have a 25% chance, 1 out of 4, for each pregnancy of having an affected baby. And option number 3 is to go through amniocentesis or chorionic biopsy testing, chorionic villus biopsy, CVS testing, during early pregnancy to determine if you can continue the pregnancy. Now, I am not going to speak to that issue from the rabbinical perspective. Let me tell you from the Ashkenaz side. I have been dealing with this for over 12 years now. I've been involved with the Rabbanim in Israel and in the United States on questions of termination for many years now. There are certain diseases that the rabbis will allow termination for. They are not broad statements by the rabbis. Each case that I've been involved with for termination, I've had to meet with the rabbi by phone or in person and explain the details of the disease so they could decide on termination options for that family. I would beg you to never let it go that far. Screening, pre-screening, knowing your status before you get married is the preferable way. If you're already married, knowing what your status is before you get pregnant is the preferable way. To be left with a decision about termination is a terrible dilemma for a young couple. This is just a picture of what pre-implantation genetic diagnosis involves. That's a fertilized egg, and that's a probe, and that's the probe that they take out some genetic material from the egg and test it and see if you have a healthy baby or not. So I'm going to finish up real quickly. I want Esty to talk a little bit, but just how is genetic testing changing the world? It's really fascinating. The reason we can test for all these diseases is something called, believe it or not, the Human Genome Project. Have any of you heard of the Human Genome Project? It was started in 1990 by the Department of Energy and the National Institute of Health and collaborative by 18 countries. And they set out to identify every single bit of DNA, of the base pairs of DNA that they could identify. This is just for your basic biology. For those of you who remember, double-stranded DNA is what forms the chromosome. And then you have these little nucleic acid base pairs. When you put a group of base pairs together, that's called a gene. When there's a mutation, the mutation occurs because there's some defect in the lining up of the base pairs, some mismatching. So what the Human Genome Project did, which is really amazing, they mapped out the entire human genome. 3 billion base pairs. They identified 20 to 25,000 genes, and they identified 1,800 new disease genes, because if you know what a normal map looks like, you can find anything that's abnormal. It's much easier, it's cheaper, it's more accurate, and it is saving lives. And the gene therapy technologies that we're developing today that will save lives in years to come comes from the Human Genome Project that was originated here in the United States, oddly enough, by the Department of Energy. That's how it all got started. There's a story behind that. So the world is changing very quickly, and it's changing because the Human Genome Project gave us the ability to find mutations, because we now know what the normal looks like, so you know what an abnormal location of a gene mutation looks like. Just to close, the Tay-Sachs program, which was implemented in the 70s, one of my professors, Dr. Kolodny, was the person who described the original deficiency in Tay-Sachs disease. Since the screening programs have been started, there's been more than a 90% reduction in Tay-Sachs disease. Tay-Sachs disease today is a non-Jewish disease because it's only found in populations that don't get screened for Tay-Sachs disease. Whereas years ago, we used to see 60 to 70 births a year. Now we see 2 to 5, and it's primarily in non-Jewish individuals. So that's the success story. And there's only 2 ways to identify a carrier. One, through genetic screening, and unfortunately, the other way is to have a baby with an affected Tay-Sachs baby. Just for those of you who have questions, and I'm going to end with a letter from a very conscientious mom. The differences between the Dor Yeshorim Ashkenaz program and our program I've laid out for you here. Our testing is done with salivary DNA sequencing by a kit that comes in the mail. Their testing is done by blood drawing. Sometimes they go to the high school, sometimes people go to labs to do it. Our panel tests for 213 carrier states. Their panel currently tests for their basic panel is 9. Their extended panel is 16, and their Sephardic panel is 22, and then they have 2 other diseases that they consider optional. They have their reasons for testing for fewer diseases. I don't personally agree with those reasons, but they have their specific reasons for it. Our results are informed, and all results are given in writing to participants. Dor Yeshorim, no results are supposed to be given out to any participant. Genetic counseling is mandatory as part of the JScreen program. Genetic counseling is not part of the Dor Yeshorim program. Couple matching, we discussed, is part of our program. It's also part of the Dor Yeshorim program. The cost, ours is a flat fee cost, whether you have private insurance or Medicaid, of $325. Their cost ranges anywhere from $275 to $350 to $450, depending on what you need and how quickly you need it. And for specifics on pricing, I advise you to go to their website. It was a little hard to figure out. But in any event, they're different programs. They're being run differently. They're being administered differently. They're both great programs. Dor Yeshorim is a wonderful program. It's just not the program I would choose to set up for a community that has such a high educational level and an interest in their health care. It's also years later. Dor Yeshorim was set up in the 70s. 2018, things have changed dramatically. I'm going to close with a quick letter. This was written by a patient of mine who was referred to me last year, who have a baby with a specific very serious genetic disorder. And the mom who wrote this, I have to tell you, I met her last year when this baby was born. They're patients of mine. He's the most gorgeous baby I've ever cared for. He's absolutely beautiful. And I asked her to write something today because I wanted her to represent. She knows about the program. I've talked to her about it along the way and the need, and she's going through efforts to get pregnant now through IVF. So I just wanted to read it to you. It's very quick, but it's very important. And for those of you who believe that I wrote it, you'll understand when I read it, the word legit is in here, which I have never used except when talking to my daughter. Hi guys, I just wanted to let you know how a genetic disease changed me and my spouse's life. Let's just go back a couple of months. It was unexpected and not planned, but we got pregnant on our honeymoon. We were so happy. We just couldn't believe it. We went to the OBGYN in the first weeks and it was legit. I recall the doctor mentioned something to me about doing genetic testing and asked if I had a chance to go. I then told him that they didn't have availability for us until after our honeymoon. So I figured that it would be no big deal to go after the honeymoon. We went to do the test while I was pregnant and we found out we were both carriers for a serious genetic disease. We then did an amniocentesis and found out our unborn baby had the disease we were carriers for. Something that only 35 people in the world have, mainly in Israel. Our baby had a 25% chance of having it, so 75% of the odds were with us. But guess again, the curiosity and nervousness killed us. They told us this disorder would come out from ages 2 to 15 years old. I couldn't stop thinking about what was going to be, but we got through it with a positive outlook and the correct medical guidance from Dr. Dietrich and Sepharadim. They really had a big part helping us and know that with what we have and what we carry, the possibilities are endless. We will use the knowledge we have to make an impact and do the best job we can as parents. I highly recommend doing genetic testing. Don't think because you are Syrian that this isn't going to happen to you. Just because something is rare, it's not rare when it happens to your child. Please do the right thing and take the time to do this because I'll tell you it's a much easier path to go down. This young lady is one of the most courageous people I have personally ever come across, and I've met a lot of good people over the years. Something that she said at the end was critical to understand. She said, it's just because something is rare doesn't mean you don't test for it. Because if it happens to you, it's not rare. The disease we're talking about, in that baby's case, the chance of her parents being a carrier were about 1 in 270, 280, Kostev syndrome. It's somewhere up there. 1 in 270, 280 Jews are carrying that gene, but they found each other. One of the arguments that we've heard from certain organizations about not doing testing for too many things is don't test for the ultra rare diseases because you're going to mess up too many potential marriages. I want to mess up those marriages, potentially. Not marriages after they happen, marriages before they happen. If a person is a 1 in 270 carrier and their spouse is a 1 in 270 carrier, it doesn't matter. They still have a 25% chance in each pregnancy of having a baby. This young couple, thank God, is going now through the process to have healthy children. And they're going to have 10 healthy children or more if they choose, but they're doing it smart and they're doing it advising people in the community not to go through what they went through, and I admire that tremendously. So I thank everybody for having me. We're going to have question and answer period. The only thing I would ask of folks during the question period after Esty is finished is if you have very unique situations that don't apply to the general topic, see me privately after lecture so we don't get everybody too involved in those specifics. But I want to introduce now, she's genetic counselor for JScreen. She runs the community outreach program for JScreen. She is absolutely one of the brightest young folks I've met in a long time, and she's been critical in working with me and working with our organization to get everything up and going, and she's going to be a great resource for the community. So I'd like to introduce Esty Rose, genetic counselor.
Okay, hi, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for having me, Dr. Dietrich. We probably should have compared our slides a little bit before tonight because I realized that a lot of the things that I had prepared, Dr. Dietrich already said, so some things I might run through a little bit quickly. But as he mentioned, my name is Esty, and I'm a genetic counselor. I've been a genetic counselor for almost 9 years now. I recently started working for JScreen about 1.5 years ago. Before I was at JScreen, I had worked at Montefiore, which is in the Bronx, part of Einstein Medical School. So I've been in the Jewish community pretty much since I graduated grad school. So I've seen it all, basically. Like every single story that Dr. Dietschik said, I could probably top you with 10 more stories of something similar. So I think I have a pretty good grasp on the community, but the Sephardic community is still a little bit foreign to me. So we've done a lot of research about different needs of the community, and at JScreen we're trying to fit those needs. So a little bit about us. So Dr. Dietschik already mentioned that we're an at-home Jewish genetic disease screening program. We're based out of Emory, so our medical director and everyone involved is actually at Emory in Atlanta. But because everything is done at home and everything is done remotely, we have people and staff members all over the country, actually, which is pretty cool. So I'll call people and they think I have a 404 number, which is an Atlanta number, and I'll say I'm actually down the block from you in the 5 towns. But which is pretty cool that we're able to, serve the entire country. There are Jews everywhere, which I'm learning. At JScreen, we have now completed every single state, so we've tested at least one person per state. So that was a really big accomplishment when we got there. So even though we're based in Atlanta, we're seeing patients from all over the country. Our staff includes medical and scientific directors, specifically at Emory. We have 3 certified genetic counselors. We have a bunch of people who work in the front office. We have outreach specialists, myself, and we have a national outreach specialist. We have an IT guy. So we're a pretty legit organization, and I am very proud to be part of this organization just because I know that all the people behind it are really good at what they do, and they're highly trained and highly skilled. So because we are out of Emory, we have to be very careful about privacy issues, and we're basically like any doctor's office because of that. So every single result and every single piece of information that's shared with us from our patients has to be done confidentially. Everything is done at home. The kit comes to your house in the mail. You don't have to walk into a building where everybody sees where you're coming from, where you're going. It's just very discreet. It's just a FedEx mailer, which I'm sure we get FedExes and Amazon boxes all the time. It's just another one of those boxes. We're very, very careful about privacy as well. All of our reports are sent to the ordering physician, which will be Dr. Dietschik in most cases. And also, like he mentioned before, all of the participants also receive a copy of the results. Nobody else. So the doctor who ordered the test, Dr. Dietschik, and also the participant, and nobody else is allowed to have access to anybody's reports. Every single thing that we do is kept in a secure firewall protected database at Emory University. Don't really know what that means, but I know it's really secure. Everything is just super, super password protected and all those HIPAA things that we need to follow. So we're not just an organization that's run by civilians out of their garage. We're a pretty legitimate organization because of the fact that we're at Emory. So, like I mentioned before, I didn't really know much about the Sephardic community until pretty recently. There's been a lot of emphasis in the past on Tay-Sachs disease, like Dori Sharim, and all these other diseases that we've learned about over the last couple of years in the Ashkenazi community. But I think what I've heard from the community in the Sephardi and Mizrahi communities is, oh, we don't have these diseases. We don't need to worry about it. It's an Ashkenaz thing. We don't have Tay-Sachs. And we kind of went with that for quite a bit until pretty recently because we didn't really know much about it either. So we knew there's got to be something, but as Dr. Dietschik mentioned, now he's actually seeing kids who have these diseases, and we're realizing that there are Sephardic diseases and there are Mizrahi diseases that were always there, but now we know more about them. So over the last couple of years, there have been many labs that have been starting to offer genetic testing for some of these common Sephardi diseases. Until then, it's really been only Ashkenazi diseases, so there wasn't really much to do. But now we're lucky enough to have these labs that are offering much larger panels of diseases. As Dr. Dietschik mentioned, we're testing for over 200 diseases now. And our panel is what we call a pan-ethnic panel. So pan-ethnic means that it's kind of like a one-size-fits-all. It's for people who are Ashkenazi, it's for people who are Sephardi, it's for people who are Mizrahi, it's for people who are African American and Asian and Finnish. It's for everybody out there. And the reason that we started to do these kind of panels instead of Sephardi-only panels and Ashkenazi-only panels is because, like you mentioned, there's a lot of intermarriage and people don't necessarily know so much about their family histories. They think they know, but then some, great-great-grandfather migrated somewhere one day and nobody knew about it. So people thought they knew more about themselves than they actually did, and that's why we think it's important to cover all the bases we possibly can. Again, we're in the United States, and we're also testing people who are intermarrying even outside the Jewish faith, so we think it's important that everybody gets tested, even if they're not Jewish. So once these panels started to become more popular and the lab started offering testing for these Sephardic diseases, at JScreen, we decided that we need to get to the community and explain to them that there actually are diseases. And yes, Tay-Sachs is probably not going to be that common in our patients from the Sephardic communities, but there are other diseases that we need to worry about. So I know that you had met with some community leaders, but so did we. And we met with various members of the community and various community leaders just to try to help us understand the community and the fears of the community and the needs of the community so that we can understand how people feel about genetic testing. And we learned a lot from different focus groups that we had and different patient stories that we had and different classes that we had. I actually went to a class in Stern College one night a couple years ago. It was a Sephardic halacha class. And I just spoke to the girls for about an hour and a half, and I just asked them tons of questions, just say like, tell me a little bit about yourselves, because I'm not so familiar with it. And I learned so much about the different questions and the different fears and worries that people have. So I think over the years, we've started to gain an appreciation for what the Sephardi community wants. And because of that, we're very sensitive to the needs, and we try to make testing as easy as possible. And I don't know if unintimidating is a word. I didn't underline in red, but I think it's a word. But we want to make it not scary, because I think that people question it and say, like, why do we need to do this? This is not for us. Why do we need to know all this information? So we're trying to make it as unscary as possible. So the ultimate goal of doing genetic testing is to help as many families as possible by doing appropriate genetic testing. It says in Devarim, "Rak hishamer lecha u'shmor nafshecha me'od v'nishmartem me'od lenafshosechem." You have to safeguard your health. And we believe, as Torah-abiding Jews, that the way to safeguard your health is to be careful about things and to try to be precautionary about things and to try to do things before bad things happen. So to me, preconception genetic testing is the way to go. You're doing whatever you can to prevent people in your family from getting sick. So to me, we're just doing this to stop having sick babies in the community, and the way to do it is to do appropriate genetic screening. I heard you mention this when I walked in, but there is a very famous tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein. When Tay-Sachs testing was just coming on the scene at the late 1970s, somebody asked him, so should we do this testing? It's clinically available. Is there a chiyuv for us to do it? Should we be doing it? Do we have to do it? Is it bad if we don't do it? And here was his answer. I don't have to read it in Hebrew, but basically what he said is not doing the genetic testing is like crossing the street with your eyes closed. And I think that's a really strong way to say it, that, yeah, you got to do this because you're endangering your family members and your future family members if you are not careful about it in the first place. So a little bit about the JScreen process. So after people go to the JPatable website and they register as in the JPatable database, then they get sent over to the JScreen website. Basically what happens is you request your kit, everything is done online. We send you a kit in the mail. Just a tube, I should have brought one, sorry. Just a little tube, it's not a bottle that you had mentioned, I promise, it's like this much saliva. You spit into the tube. Inside the box there's a prepaid mailer, and you just throw it in a FedEx box and it goes straight to the lab. And then the lab usually gives us the results within 2 to 3 weeks. So everything is done probably from start to end. It takes 3 to 4 weeks to finish the whole process. Once the results come into us at JScreen, myself and our other genetic counselors look through them and we make sure that everything is sensible, and then we give them to the patients. So this is very different than Doré Share because we do give results to our patients. So every single client of ours does get a copy of the results. So many people ask us, well, why is that important? All we need to know is whether we're genetically compatible with each other. And I came up with a couple of reasons why I think it's a really good idea for people to get their results. The first thing is, in case you are both carriers of the same disease, it's really good to know a little bit about the disease. Some of the diseases are very severe, some of them are milder, and different decisions might be made based on exactly what the disease is. So just to say you're both common carriers for a disease, to me it's not enough, because something like Tay-Sachs, where you have unfortunately babies who pass away within 2 to 3 years of living, on one spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum you can have babies who might have Gaucher disease, which is a very treatable condition, and many people who have it don't even know they have it. So just to say you're a common carrier couple, to me, is not enough, and I think that people should learn about the disease before they make big decisions about their family planning. For a very few number of the diseases, sometimes carriers could experience mild symptoms. So it would be good to know what you're a carrier for. So in case you happen to be a carrier for one of those diseases, you could be on the lookout and make sure that in case you are symptomatic, you're seeing the right specialists and you're seeing the right doctors, just in case. Again, this doesn't happen often. I can maybe off the top of my head think of 5 diseases that we test for where carriers do have an increased risk to have symptoms, but it would be good to know if you were one of them. And also I just think that if you're going to get the results from any test, why not get for your genetic test? When you go to the doctor and they take your blood pressure, they tell you whether or not you have high blood pressure. They tell you your cholesterol results, So you're doing a genetic test. It's just like any other test out there. And I believe that we have a right to know our results, and we should know our results, and we should, be proactive and take ownership of our health and our genetic information. Dr. Dietschik also mentioned that it's really important to share the information with family members. Anything that we test for, your siblings will have a 50% chance of being a carrier if you're a carrier as well. So if you just say to your brother, hey, you should get tested, he's probably not going to get tested because people are lazy and people tend to push things off. But if you say to your brother, hey, I was a carrier for 5 things, make sure you get tested, I think it's going to push him a little bit further to do it, and it's going to remind him, even more about the importance of testing. Also, I think it's a really good idea to know exactly what you were tested for. So when you get a copy of your lab report, it will have the diseases that you're positive for, as well as all the other diseases that you're negative for. So you'll have a full list of all the diseases that you've been tested for. And it's a good idea to just keep that list in your pocket. Like you mentioned, when you go to your OBGYN, it's good to know what you've been tested for. So in case you need to get updated or rescreened, we know what's missing and what's not missing. I know of a case, unfortunately, of a woman who thought she got tested in her first pregnancy, and then in her second pregnancy, they said, did you get tested? And she said, yeah, everything was fine. They never said anything to me. And it turns out that both she and her husband were carriers for a very serious disease. I know they have 2 babies who are affected. So had they said, show us a copy of those results from your first pregnancy, she would have realized, hey, I don't have a copy, and she would have gotten retested for her second or third pregnancy. So just important to take ownership of your things and your health, and to be aware of what you're a carrier for. After the results are in, aside from getting a copy of the results, we also have all of our clients speak to a genetic counselor. So that's either myself or one of many other genetic counselors that we have on staff. So all of our genetic counselors understand and are trained to explain lab reports. This is what we went to school for. This is what we do. We're qualified to answer questions about what the results mean for the individual getting tested and for their other family members. We're very sensitive to the personal nature of this information. This is what we do all the time. So we have a lot of people who share very personal information with us. We're not telling anybody. We're not posting it on Facebook afterwards. We're very sensitive, and we don't really share a lot, even with each other, because we're very careful about that. And we try to be very flexible with scheduling. So we have night hours, we have Sunday hours. We really try to make it work for all of our patients. So I just don't want to forget that we're not just a genetic testing program, we're a Jewish genetic testing program. We are a Jewish non-for-profit. Most of our staff members are Jewish, and because of that, we have a very good understanding of the community, the values, the needs. We've been doing this for years. We get it. We get the people that are coming in. And we also understand the shidduch world. So especially in JScreen, I'm like the resident film person. So I like to train people about what the shidduch crisis is and how shidduchim work and how people get married after only a couple of dates, and it's totally terrifying to some people on our staff, but by now they get it and they understand what we're doing and why we're a little bit different than the Jew from North Dakota. And because they understand the shidduch world, they also understand the needs, and having people say, I need the results really soon, like we get it. We can't always provide that because that has to do with the lab, but we understand that the shidduch world is just a little bit different than the general dating world. So when to get tested, so Dr. Dietschik mentioned that we can start doing testing by age 18. Anybody younger than 18 will not be accepted into the program for JScreen. We need to wait until their 18th birthday. And we also say that it's important to get tested before any pregnancy. So whether it's a first pregnancy or a subsequent pregnancy, it's always good just to make sure that your testing is up to date. Even if you've already had healthy children, it still is possible that you and your partner could be carriers for the same thing and you were just lucky the first time around, and something could unfortunately happen in the future. So just a couple of statistics. So like I said, we're screening for over 200 diseases. These diseases are common in people of all backgrounds. That's why I said we're calling it a pan-ethnic panel. We recently updated our panel just around Pesach time. So since then, our statistics have shown that over 70% of our participants are carriers for at least one thing. 70% is a really high number. I'm surprised if somebody's not a carrier for something nowadays. So it's not a big deal. It's not a stigma. You had mentioned that it doesn't really mean anything about you. It doesn't mean that you're going to be a bad wife or a bad husband or a bad father or a bad mother. It just means that you're a carrier. We're all carriers for things. I'm a carrier for a couple things that I know about. Who knows what I don't know about. We're all carriers for something. But I just don't want to scare people here, and I do want to say that only a very, very small number of couples are carrier couples. So it's not that common that we see that two diseases overlap between a couple. It's very uncommon, but when it does happen, we want to catch it before something bad happens. After every one of our participants goes through the whole program, we send them a satisfaction survey. Every 2 weeks, we take a look at those statistics, and the latest one from last week revealed a 99.02% satisfaction with JScreen, which is pretty good for a Jewish organization. People like to complain, so we like that number, and it's really rising from week to week. We're really getting close to 100 there. So just to reiterate what I said before, there are Jewish genetic diseases that are not Ashkenazi. There are diseases that are more common in different Sephardic communities. Depending on your country of origin, there are a different list of diseases that we need to think about. So here are just a couple of examples. You might have heard of some of these conditions. You may not have heard of them. There are many more, but here's just an example. And I just wanted to end by saying that knowledge is power, and I really strongly believe that getting tested before pregnancy is the way to go, and getting tested in a responsible way, in a medically, in a good medical center is always a good idea, and it's good to know your information so that you can empower yourself and your partner, and you can also empower other family members. And that's it.
Thank you, Essie. That was great. I just want to say that my practice has about a 0.08% satisfaction rate compared to JScreen's 99.2. But two quick things just to add to what Esty said. Even, first of all, to qualify what I said before about the marriages the arranged marriages that we try to discourage are obviously for the most serious diseases. If somebody has, as they mentioned, Gaucher disease, I happen to be one of the specialists who treats Gaucher patients nationally. Gaucher disease is fascinating because, as Esty said, it can sit quiet for 30 years until a person knows they have it. But if you do get diagnosed with Gaucher, and I have many patients that I've been treating for Gaucher, it's now 1 pill a day. That's the treatment. You take a pill a day, 1 tablet, once or twice a day, and you basically will stave off most of the horrible things from Gaucher disease. If you treat a child under the age of 10 or 11 with Gaucher disease, they'll never develop the bone disease associated with Gaucher disease. The treatment is that good. So not everything needs to be discouraged, but everything needs genetic counseling and advice to figure out what to do if you're discovered to have one of those common mutations. And as Esty said, I've been doing comparative matching for the Ashkenaz side for many years, for my own patients, for other people's patients. It's very rare that we have to tell somebody you can't get married. It's extremely rare. Well, I wouldn't say extremely rare, it's rare. It doesn't happen that often. Many of us are carriers, but fortunately not for the same things. So we're going to open it up to questions for Esty and myself.
I have a couple of questions. What's the difference between J-Patable and JScreen?
First question, what's the difference between J-Patable and JScreen? J-Patable is the matching part of the program.
Okay.
We're the ones who will tell people whether their couple compatibility is correct or not. In other words, do you have a problem to worry about? If you have a child, you want your child to get married and they meet somebody or they're fixed up with somebody, you call J-Patable. We have both of the results, and we will be able to look at the results and compare them and say whether there's a common carrier state. JScreen is responsible for the testing part of the program. JScreen is responsible for the genetic counseling part of the program. But the joint comparison of the results is J-Patable's responsibility. That's our responsibility.
Okay, thanks. I have another couple of questions. How is it possible to make it mandatory in the high schools? And how are you getting out the word to the high school? I happen to have been a little involved with Dory Shuram, and Rabbi Epstein came to my house, and they really tried to, get me involved. And I spoke to the rabbis, and they were not interested.
Me too.
I was like, I'm shocked to
I'm
be
just
here,
more
to hear that they're
perseverant than
interested. I guess I didn't have the platform, I mean, I'm just.
So the question is, how do we intend to reach out to the high school? So the answer is simple. We're starting right away. Is that Aura in the back? I don't have my glasses on. Aura Sutton, who's works with Mag and David and with the seniors in Mag and David. We're going to be speaking to the 12th grade in Mag and David very shortly before they leave for their pre-graduation break. And we will have community outreach to every 12th grade in the Sparta community to talk to the 12th graders about the need for premarital genetic testing. We're going to explain it to them in ways that 12th graders can understand it. The language we use in a lecture like this is different than the language we would use to a 12th grader. That's the training that we put our folks through. SD is expert at speaking to people of all ages, obviously, but we're going to modify those talks appropriately for the 12th graders. Eventually, we want every 12th grader, when they turn 18, to enroll in the JScreen program. That's the goal. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time, but it will happen. And as far as the rabbis are concerned, I have to say, I've dealt with rabbis from all over the world on genetic issues for years. The Sephardic rabbis, when I finally got them all in a room together, and Rabbi Ozeri was critical in making that happen, they are amongst the smartest that I've dealt with and the most conscientious. And they asked incredibly tough questions of me and incredibly detailed questions of me. And they agreed that the time is correct to go and teach the community about these risks and make sure that we do the right thing. And I think that's an incredible credit to them. I'll get you in a second.
Is it an automatic that an OBGYN will ask a young mother whether she had children or not to do this testing, or it's something that they have to initiate? Because I mean, I'm not.
The question was, is it automatic that an OBGYN will encourage a patient when they get pregnant to go through genetic testing? So I'm going to let SD field it, but I'll tell you what when I was with the consortium, the Jewish Genetic Disease Consortium, I taught OBs from all over the country for Grand Rounds program, and I will tell you that the majority of OBs, they have difficulty figuring out what to do because there's different recommendations from different professional groups. The American College of OBGYN gives them one recommendation. The Jewish genetic screening programs may give a different recommendation. It becomes confusing for them. If you live in the New York area, the majority of conscientious OBGYNs will encourage every patient that walks in that door to get a full panel repeated. Esther, if you want to comment.
Yeah, I think in the New York area where the OBGYNs know that this is a heavily Jewish area, they're much better at doing that. I can't say they're doing that all around the country. Another thing that I always tell people is that OBGYNs specialize in OBGYN. They don't specialize in genetics, they don't specialize in orthopedics or dermatology. So I think it's important that they mention it, but they're not always so up to date when it comes to genetics. So they might be checking off a box on one of their millions of sheets that they have to do that just says Jewish panel, but that Jewish panel might be the same panel that they used 15 years ago. So they might not be as up to date with the panels that they're ordering as they should be. So I always recommend that people go to specialists in the field that we're worried about or that we're thinking about. So I actually think that people should be going to an organization like JScreen or something similar where we're genetic specialists and we're not specialists in delivering babies.
Most of the NY doctors do it automatically. I don't know if they're on risk doctors.
Yeah.
But I've been to more God bless my children, and most of them OBGYNs.
Yeah, so in a place like NYU, and Cornell and Mount Sinai, they are doing that, right? So in these bigger New York places, they are doing that, but not in most hospitals, I would say. So I don't want to call out one hospital. I don't know everybody's practices.
It's not necessarily Jewish. I mean, they automatically imply the fact, obviously, you want to go to genetic right away.
But there's one caveat to what Esty mentioned. The doctors, and this is where the variability comes in, ours doesn't have that variability.
Yeah.
If they use a LabCorp lab or a Quest lab or a Sunshine lab, every lab chooses their own panel. There's no standard panel out there, unfortunately. So Mount Sinai uses, thank God, a panel of 280. NYU uses a panel of about 200. There are hospitals there are doctors who are still checking the box to use panels of 16.
And 4.
And 4, yeah. So it's variable. And when you walk in with a panel of 212 or 213 diseases, that doctor, even if he doesn't know a lot about genetics, he's going to say, wow, that was pretty good. You know, they'll have an appreciation for it. They may want to retest anyways, which is fine. But at least it's a starting point, so they say, wow, you already tested for 212. Let me repeat this and make sure I'm up to snuff. So yeah, they are getting better.
Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, OBGYNs should be doing it, but
You have to.
you have to know.
And by the way, this is what we told the rabbis as well. Many married couples are discovering carrier states after marriage now in the last few years because the OBGYNs are routinely testing. Now, again, it's not a position you want to be in where you have to get tested in a rush when your spouse is pregnant, but you do what you have to do to protect your children. So no matter what we're doing, the OBGYNs should be testing those couples as well, and are.
30 years ago, I don't think we did it when we were
No.
pregnant out years, but we did something else, and then we have to do it now, you know.
Right.
other benefits.
Correct. I'm sorry, yes.
I think it's my opinion, the only way for this to be successful is if it's mandatory that the rabbis will not marry you until you've gone through this JPADable.
So
That's the only way it's going to be effective.
So the comment
because
was
people are not going to participate.
that you feel that the only way that it will be truly successful is for the rabbis to mandate it. There's two schools of thought at that. Some people say if a rabbi tells me to do it, I'm not doing it. That's my school of thought. I'm kidding. No, so you're right. It would be nice, but we have to be reasonable in our approaches to the community. It's not for us to dictate that, neither JScreen or JPADable. We will work with the rabbis and with the community to whatever degree they want, but at this point, I don't think they're mandating it, but they are strongly encouraging it. And I think, listen, I'm a pretty vocal guy, you know, and I have a practice in the community, and I use my email well. I don't do Instagram or any of those things, but I do send out information to my parents telling them what the latest things are and what they should be doing. And I promise you, the Sephardic community are much better than the Ashkenazim spreading the word. And it'll happen. It's going to happen gradually, but it will happen. And it's critical that it happens because we don't have time to waste. Every baby that is born now is on us until we fix it. And I don't want to be in that position. I want to be seeing runny noses and sore throats. So.
A second thing also, and this is addressed to the Bikuchalim staff, I think that within SBH we should have an arm, because you didn't say how expensive it is to do the IVF and all that. It is at a minimum $25,000 per test, and it could take 5, 6, 7 tries to get one pregnancy, and if you want to have 2 or 3 children. You're talking about an enormous amount of money that these young couples don't have. And I think it should be an arm of SBH to raise money to help these young couples if they're in such a position to have to do that.
Well, they have organizations that do they do have organizations for fertility and things like that. I wish SBH could be there for everybody's problems, but it's I can't even imagine, you know, going through that. But there are organizations that help, and the way we have specialties of what we do, we don't even attempt to do that because these fertility organizations know. Like if I get a call for a fertility doctor, I might give one, but I always give the organizations because I feel like they're much more trained to help them, and you know they need so many things. So I mean, I do help with that, but as far as
Bonei Olam is one of the organizations that's been very good with IVF assistance. So A-Time as well, yeah.
Can you explain the difference between the test like this and something like 23andMe that I know a lot of people are doing these days? I know it's more commercial.
I was hoping somebody would ask.
I know.
I'm going to just say one comment, then I'm going to pass. The question was, what's the difference between this and like Ancestry or 23andMe and those, how do I say the word, those cool at-home DNA tests? So, number one, anybody in this room who's told that their ancestor was wearing lederhosen or whatever they do in that 23andMe commercial, you're probably not Jewish, because I don't know any of my ancestors who wore lederhosen. But the difference is quite, and Esti's more adept at answering this question, I'm going to give it to you, Esther. You can tell them exactly what they are.
It's a good question. People get confused because we're sending saliva kits to people's homes, so we sound exactly the same as 23andMe. I don't know if you're aware that 23andMe was shut down by the FDA a couple of years ago. So when they started doing their testing, they were doing testing for common diseases like Tay-Sachs, some of these Jewish diseases, some not necessarily Jewish diseases. And then they also did some interesting things like whether or not you're a righty or lefty, and whether your hair goes this way or this way, like just interesting like genetic traits that were not necessarily related to diseases. And then one day I got an email that the FDA had shut them down until further notice because they were giving medical information without anybody giving it to them. They would just email people results, which is not cool. And that's why, obviously, as a genetic counselor, I think that's not a good idea to just email people results and not talk to them about them and explain what they could possibly mean. So since that whole FDA debacle, now they're only testing for things that you don't really need a genetic counselor to explain the results. So they're not testing for disease predispositions. They're not testing for carrier states for some of these diseases just because they're doing it direct to consumer and they're not involving medical professionals. The FDA won't allow it. So we are giving medical advice as we're giving our results, so that's how we're different.
And it's a critical difference. It's not, that testing is geared towards things that are consumer friendly, that are sexy, different I can't even get my arms around it. I watch the commercials, I pull my hair out. This is very different. This is serious genetic screening with genetic counseling, with compatibility matching, which involves, I have to tell you, even from the matching part, one question can involve hours and hours of interacting with family members and rabbis and parents, and it's hard to do what we're doing, but we're doing it because it's a great endpoint. The endpoint is to put a bunch of us out of business, which is really the endpoint. Then I'll get you in a second.
When you have, let's say it's an Ashkenaz and Sephardi couple, if one of them are tested by a different organization, but they've been tested, how do you find a way? You're right.
So the question is, if they've been tested by a different organization, an Ashkenaz organization, how do you do this with, first of all, JScreen is not a Sephardic organization strictly. It's pan-ethnic. We're testing Ashkenaz,
but
we're
they
testing
test different things.
You have to be tested for the same panel. So the answer is that when you decide you're going to date or you're going to get married, you have to make a decision which one you're going to go with. Now, if you ask me, I would advise people to go with the more extensive panel where you get genetic testing. Obviously, that's why I'm here tonight, to encourage that. You may get you will find different people within the community who will disagree. And
I was talking about people that already got tested, let's
correct,
say, by a
and to a certain degree, you have to update your testing, and you have to go spend the money to do an updated test, but that's the price you pay for safety and for safe family choices, Correct, good point. Any other questions? Or?
How does it compare to council?
So, Esty will handle this one.
So the question was, how do we compare to Council? Council is a lab that some people's OBGYNs use. Maybe that's why you've heard of it before. We use Council. That's the lab that JScreen uses. So we are Council in a way because we're contracted with Council. So all of our results come directly from Council.
And just to add to that, Council is a leader in the area of DNA sequencing. That's the technology that they use. They actually sequence those base pairs to get it down to the exact base pair for identifying a mutation. So they're very good, Council. And JScreen's been working with them for years, and I've been getting results from Council for years already as well. So we're very happy with that. Any other questions, anybody?
Can your test advise whether you're coming from Sephardi or Ashkenazi or any other source?
Can you repeat the question? Can we test?
Can the test that you do tell the person if they're coming either from Ashkenazi, Sephardi, or if they're Jewish or not?
That's a good question. So we don't do ancestry testing like that. So we can't tell you for sure, if you're Syrian or Moroccan or anything like that. Sometimes we get hints, if we see that somebody happens to be a carrier for 4 things that we know are common in Iranian Jews, it's a pretty safe bet that you have Iranian ancestry, but it's not at all an ancestry test where we don't tell you definitively where your family's from.
Excuse me, I heard it said a couple of times that JScreen is a nonprofit. Is JPalatable also a
No,
nonprofit?
JPalatable is not a nonprofit. It's a for-profit company. There's not a lot of profit involved, but it is set up as a for-profit company, yes. The pricing, just so you know, on these tests, the cost of testing has gone down dramatically in the last many years. When we started our salivary DNA program out of NYU and working, that was going back 10 years now, the cost of testing for a panel of 16 diseases, 17 diseases, was upwards of $3,000 to $4,000 and higher. There was some costs that were into the $7,000 or $8,000 range. Today, the cost of testing has come down dramatically. It's going to go lower, we hope, with time. But JScreen receives certain funding from certain foundations. We don't. But there's definitely a decrease in the cost of testing over the years. And I have to tell you, look at the numbers. We're doing 213 carrier states for a very reasonable cost to the community of $325. There's nothing like that around. The reason we're able to offer that is because of the supplemental funding that JScreen gets from some of their foundations. I think the Mark Foundation.
Yeah, the test is about $1,100, but we have a grant that allows us to reduce that price for every single patient of ours.
Yes.
No, there are other diseases that are being tested for that are not, to prevent miscarriages or blood disorders, like you test for all that, right? Like factor V and all that, because that also has to do.
Yeah, so we actually don't test for those. They're not on our base on our base. We can, somebody requests it, sometimes we can add it on a case-by-case basis, but we don't test for that. We're very strict when we decide which diseases to include on our panels and which ones not to include. They have to meet a certain set of criteria, and those specific diseases like factor V Leiden, all those thrombophilias, they don't really meet the criteria because if a child or if a baby is affected with it, it's not clinically too significant.
Right. But it could prevent things, I guess, maybe.
But we can work with the family if they have a specific concern, another family member has it. We'll arrange that testing separate from the JPalatable JScreen program.
Which is why it's really important when we ask you, when you're registering for your kit, do you have a family history of everything? Like you had mentioned in one of your slides, just tell us everything, because sometimes you're not appropriate for this test, and sometimes you might need more than just this, and we're going to help you, and we'll find somebody in the area who could do it for you if we can't do it at JScreen. So just be as transparent as possible so we can help you the most we can.
Just to build on the factor V thing, because it is a gene in my family, I'm not a carrier, but other siblings are, and I'm a Kala teacher in the community, it is something that should be addressed, because many girls are getting married, and getting onto birth control with factor V can be very dangerous, and we're concerned about it. It's just something, we don't want to scare our brides, we don't want to scare the community, but we do want to get the word out.
Yeah,
Just something for you guys to
We're gonna
think about.
listen. We're at the infancy stage. You know, we'll build on it, and we're gonna take feedback from the community, and everything we do, we're gonna run through the rabbinical council as well, and we'll work with it. Yeah. Anybody else, or we're good? I thank everybody for having us.